Welcome to this edition of Renford Rewatched. This is an analysis of the second episode of Series 1 entitled Don Bruno. I'm joined by Carl, another fan of the show, as am I. Carl, you've watched this fairly recently. What were your kind of initial thoughts of it?
I think this is the episode that everyone remembers as the one with James Corden in. That's where it's kind of gone down in history. I think out of everyone that's been on Rejects, apart from the sporting celebrities, he's probably the one that's gone on to be the most famous. So it gets picked up a lot because of that. From the point of view of a kids' TV show in the 1990s, what strikes me the most about it is its portrayal of how supportive friends can be when they know one of their other friends is being bullied. Had a little bit of Grange Hill in there, perhaps,
which obviously is something of a nod to Paul Paris, after, of course, he having been in Grange Hill himself. This episode, which I watched again, was never my favourite, and I think it's because I think maybe I had different reasons. Maybe the episodes later on in the series just appealed more to me. But what I took from it was that this is an episode where Bruno's trying to get up courage to face up to these bullies who are being problematic. And you see all this inner conflict. And then his friends are trying to help him. But it doesn't really help in the end, because when Bruno builds up all his strength, they've already done something. So it kind of comes to nothing. And I felt sort of, if that makes any sense, I felt a little bit underwhelmed by it. But I guess what you get from here is, after the first episode of introducing all the characters, you see them focusing on perhaps the most cartoony element and trying to explain it somewhat, because Bruno is Barry Grade at the end of the day.
Yeah, as I remember, once they've done the first episode, they then do a series of episodes sort of focusing on individual characters a bit more. What strikes me about this episode is there isn't actually an awful lot that happens in terms of football and things like that. It's actually, there's the B story of Stuart trying to get them all to eat healthily, which ends up not working out in the end, and that's about it really. Because then we've got Jason and QPR a bit later on, and there's Ben and the girl. I'm not sure if they do an episode on Ronnie. I always remember him being quite a two-dimensional character for the first 2 seasons until he sort of disappears, and then pops back up occasionally later on. From the point of view of the episode, we can sort of see where Bruno gets his Italian football obsession from. I think we all knew someone in the 1990s who was obsessed with Italian football as it sort of started to infiltrate the mainstream via Channel 4's Football Italia show on at the weekends. And so because it was more mainstream, there was inevitably someone at school that was always a big fan of Italian football and claimed they'd supported Lazio or Inter Milan their entire life, when actually it'd been about 10 minutes.
I think you're right on that one. I think it's definitely sort of an exaggeration of the kind of thing that used to go on in the 90s. One observation, and I think you see it in the first few scenes, is Stuart that posh later in the series, or?
I did actually have this written down. I think it kind of it tapers off a bit. He starts off as a very sort of almost gentlemanly voice, and then I think he just kind of has his own voice towards the end of season 3. I think that's probably one reason why he had the Chelsea shirt as well, because I don't know if it was implied that people that supported Chelsea were all posh in the 1990s. I had a friend at school who was certainly a bit more well off than I was, but I wouldn't have called him posh by any means. Yeah, like I say, they'd start off as very sort of cartoonish caricatures, and then almost grow as the program moves on.
Yes, because Eddie at this point is still sort of 70% Elvis impersonator. A lot of the lines are derived from songs by Elvis Presley, and I don't know, just the general vibe of it. But I've always liked Eddie as a character.
What I like is when the other rejects and Eddie find out from Vinny that Bruno's being bullied. They want to get together. They want to do something, but they are still a bit scared of the Razors. They know how tough they are compared to them, and the fact that Eddie actually goes to that length to do something shows how much he genuinely sort of cares about these kids who probably prop his business up, to be honest, given the amount of other customers he has in there on a daily basis.
Well, I'm guessing at this point that Terry and the Razors have never actually been in Graceland, because I think that's what used to annoy me, was like, that's quite clearly Eddie from Graceland's at the end.
Yeah, and it's quite clearly Alex Norton dressed as the Godfather figure later on in the episode as well. If you knew him from as a local businessman, you'd obviously recognise him, but he has absolutely no idea who he is.
Well, especially as the accent keeps slipping in and out. It's sort of part Godfather, part Scottish.
Yes, I did notice that as well.
Like you say, and we can address the elephant in the room, and I will be talking to Tom later in this episode about working with James Corden at this point. Is this the appearance that catapulted him to superstardom?
I remember him most as I was a big fan of Channel 4's Teachers drama that was on a few years afterwards. And I always remember him as maybe Jeremy, I think his character was called, who was in Andrew Lincoln's class. And for me, he was, that's where I remember seeing him the first time round. He was the kid that was always talking to the teacher and befriended him the most. And then it was only on rewatching Renford did I then go, hold on a minute, it's James Corden. I'd completely forgotten he was ever in this show.
Yeah, because he plays Razor number 1, as he's been titled, which is because he's a speaking role. Terry Stoker as a character, I think he perhaps works a little bit when he's got somebody almost stronger to bounce off of, like Basil Stoker.
Yes, he kind of worked a little bit better as the sidekick rather than the main antagonist, as obviously Stoker was the sort of pantomime villain of the show. And so Terry not quite understanding what his dad was talking about and things like that. Yeah, he kind of worked a little bit better as the sidekick villain rather than the main one.
So, what observations that we haven't already talked about have you taken from watching this episode again?
My first one that I always meant to, I've always been curious if Roger Davies has ever thought of himself as a pioneer when YouTube came online. He was like, well, hold on a minute, Vinny was doing that, 10 years ago on British TV. He was filming himself and then, well, not putting it on the internet probably because that wasn't really a thing then. But, this was a guy that was kind of filming himself and then putting it out there for other people to watch. So, I like to think that he was very much a pioneer of the YouTuber creator movement. He was probably the world's first content creator in that respect.
I guess the thing that we can also mention here is the sportscaster, Jim Rosenthal, who appears in this episode for the first time. I think he doesn't appear in the first one.
No, I don't think him and Bob Wilson are in the opening episode. So he just kind of randomly pops up. And if you were a big fan of sports at the time, perhaps a parent watching it with a kid, you'd be like, why is Jim Rosenthal just randomly popped up in the middle of the show? And I'd always be curious to know whether him and Bob Wilson ever knew that the sections, because they never appeared in the show with the other characters. It was always just them in the studio doing some bits. So I always wondered whether or not they were aware of what the thing that they were filming, what it was actually for, whether they just kind of paid them some money, turn up and say a few lines, and then go back to your day job.
Because I feel like a lot later, there was an episode where Vinny was going to do work experience or something, and he sort of sees them from a distance, and that's about the closest you ever get to any of them interacting with the main cast. But this was sort of a funny little aside, if you will, and it is humorous. I think maybe the joke wears a little bit thin later in the series. Jim constantly going, and what? Vinny Rodriguez, it's a little bit tired, but at this point, it's still like, oh, it's those people. it's confusing.
It adds a nice level of surrealism to the program because you've got this guy who's obviously just presenting to himself in a camera in his bedroom, and then all of a sudden he's being introduced within the realms of the show by popular TV commentators who have absolutely no idea where he is. So I always quite liked that they did that, because it made absolutely no sense. There is nothing you could do, even if you were said, well, is it all in Vinny's head or something like that? It makes absolutely no sense within the context of the show. And that, I think, is what makes it such a great little segment to put in.
Along with the talking poster.
Yes.
We need to talk about the talking poster.
Well, that foreshadowed the appearance of Zola, didn't it? Later on in the series, there was Zola and Martin Keown appeared in the same episode. I remember Keown had been brought in by the Razors as a ringer, and Zola had been brought in by the Rejects. And then it turned out that Zola wanted to be a hard man of football, and Martin Keown wanted to be the player running rings around all the defenders, and both the Rejects and the Razors couldn't believe that had actually happened. And that was quite funny to sort of see them play opposites of their caricatures as they were sort of seen in popular culture at the time.
Yeah, that's a long way into the series. I think it's series 3. The thing to talk about as well, I guess, is the use of music, which unfortunately has meant that it isn't on streaming. It's not really anywhere because of the music that's contained. There's so much recorded music. I mean, there's sections from The Godfather in this particular episode that we're talking about. There's a track in there from The Fun-Loving Criminals. Obviously, the Club to Death thing. And one thing that my wife pointed out as she was watching it, because she's not a Rejects fan, really. She didn't know what it was until I introduced it to her a couple of years ago. And she kind of pointed out that it heightens the scenes. I think scenes would be a lot less interesting if it didn't have that music in.
Yes, most definitely. And that was all very, I suppose that wasn't sort of mainstream music at the time when the show was on air either. It was sort of very much, bands like Manic Street Preachers and the Fun-Loving Criminals were popular, but they weren't sort of the mainstream bands that were at the top of the charts at the time. But that it kind of surfed that Britpop, the end of that sort of Britpop wave, its inclusion in the show is great, really. I cannot hear the first few bars of Australia by the Manic Street Preachers without thinking of the Renford Rejects at all. And I remember when I first watched the show, I was very confused as why they had a song that kept going on about the country Australia in a show set in London. And when I very first watched the show, before I'd heard any of the characters speak, my first thought was, is it a show from Australia? Because we had lots of dramas on kids' TV at the time, like Pugwall and Kelly, that were imports from Australia at that point. And so I just thought maybe it's another Australian import. But then obviously once they opened their mouths, you realise that they've all got southern accents, and it's set in London. So yeah, I always wondered why that particular song. I guess maybe it was just a favourite of one of the producers, and they just thought, this is a great track, we're going to slot this in on the titles.
And it just works because those opening bars, like you say, are so kind of synonymous now with the Rejects. I feel like, having seen the series so many times, there's always some kind of storyline every few episodes about getting fit and healthy or changing a state of mind in some way, certainly in these early ones. And in this one, obviously, Priscilla's trying to encourage everybody to eat more healthy. What is exactly the Arsenal diet?
This was about the time Arsene Wenger had started at Arsenal, and he kind of brought in that whole idea of footballers being, obviously they were well-trained athletes beforehand, but if you listen to interviews with footballers from like the 80s or the 90s, they weren't on healthy diets. They'd be, going to the takeaway the night before a game, and some of the footballers were known for, drinking heavily and things like that. And he was kind of the one that kind of brought in that idea that footballers were professional athletes as much as entertainers, and so they had to have that sort of diet that reflected that. These days, it's all the rage. You could imagine that every footballer is on the Arsenal diet now, as are quite a lot of people in mainstream culture. But at the time, It's very much, it's kind of like that lads magazine culture of, beer and fast food and things like that. So yeah, to sort of salad was kind of seen as it's just something on the side of your plate that made your plate pretty, rather than something you would actually order in a restaurant.
Thank you for explaining that, because I was wondering as I was watching, and I have seen comments before like, what does that mean? But yeah, do you think that these episodes, I mean, this episode in particular, does it still stand up today, or is it very topical? Is there too many topical references in there?
I think the idea that teenagers would rather eat junk food than healthy food, I think is still very much relevant. I know my son would rather eat junk food than healthy food, given the choice. But if he was serious about playing football, I don't think that would be true at all. I think that any youngster who's serious about sports and athletics and things like that is going to go in the direction of very much a healthy diet first and foremost, because they know now that sort of that level of nutrition is what they need to keep their fitness levels up. So I suppose in that respect, if this was a, I don't know, five-a-side football team that played in some sort of local league, they probably wouldn't be eating burgers and chips and pizza quite as often as the Rejects do. But yeah, certainly a show of its time with regards to that. The bullying part of it, I think that's a universal message, and having a group of friends that can stand up to people for you or with you, yeah, that's a timeless one.
I think so. That's what struck me anyway, that there's a lot of very universal themes in here, and I think sometimes people can get caught over by technology, clothes, sometimes even language, but the underlying themes of these things are still incredibly relevant. At this time, I wasn't really that into football, and that's why this is really surprising that I'm sat here talking about the Renford Rejects, because to me it wasn't about the football, it was about everything else. All the other elements, the fact that it was a comedy thing, the fact that Eddie was an Elvis enthusiast. I love sort of rock and roll and rockabilly and all that type of thing. It was really about identity, and that's what this episode is about, I think. You can just be who you are, and it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. And it's kind of interesting that they almost go down the Terry only starts to respect him once he realizes who his family are, and there's something quite interesting about that idea, where it's like Bruno isn't strong enough, it seems, to stand up on his own 2 feet. His family need to prop him up in the eyes of other people, and that's not necessarily where he wants to be. And I think that there's a lot to take from Bruno's character. I wonder if any Italians were ever offended.
I always like the fact that at no point do any of his friends ever question the fact that he's sort of suddenly started. They obviously knew him as the Brummy Barry grade up until whatever year they're in at this point. And at no point do they question the fact that he started talking with the Italian accent. They don't go, oh, Barry, knock it off. This is starting to get a bit old or anything like that. They never question it at all. They just completely accept him for who he is. And I also quite like the fact that I suppose Renford has quite a diverse cast as well, which, at the time wasn't kind of I don't know. I don't want to get too much into this, but it's perhaps become a bit of the box ticking with a lot of modern shows. Whereas back then, you just kind of accepted it, and you didn't question the fact that that it had this diverse cast, and it was nice. I always loved the fact that the best footballer in the show was always a girl.
Yeah.
As well. When at the time, it was very much, women's football wasn't really anything in the 1990s. I don't mean that to belittle it. Obviously, it's very big now. No one really thought anything of it, and it was like, well, girls can't play football. Like the sort of that view that Basil Stoker has. You're a girl, you can't play for the school team. Was very much a view of a lot of I suppose PE teachers. We all knew a PE teacher like Basil Stoker. I think that's what made him such a great character to watch. And so, yeah, the fact that Robin was obviously the best player on the team, and the rest of them have got absolutely no idea. Even someone like Jason, who you could argue is probably semi-decent at football, but he has a very overinflated impression of himself. He's that kid that always wants to play up front because he wants to score loads of goals, but actually he's just not very good.
Jason, I think, was the ego, or the mouth, as they sometimes referred to him. If you were to give this episode a rating out of 10, what do you think you would give it? I think for me, I'd give it maybe a 6, because it is the Rejects, but there's no football in it really, and it's not quite there yet.
Yeah, I think a 6 or a 7. I like how they sort of they fatten out Bruno's character a little bit. In the first episode, you're like, well, okay, is this guy actually Italian? And then you see his bedroom, which I think is probably the only time we ever see any house with any of the Rejects in the whole show. And he's obviously plastered it with all these pictures of footballers and stuff. So you can tell why he's pretending to be Italian. There's that very small line as well where he actually talks in his Brummie accent for like one little bit. Like the illusion sort of cracks a little bit, and he's probably thinking to himself, maybe I should stop doing this. But then he decides to be true to himself, like saying, he's like, well, I want to be Italian. I'm obsessed with Italy, so this is who I am. Take it or leave it. And I also like how we get to see a little bit more of how much Eddie cares for the team as well. You can tell there's obviously some history there between those. There's some unexplained backstory between those characters and him, and maybe they've been going to his cafe since they were 5 or 6 years old with their parents, and he's just kind of known them all for years, and that's why he's good friends with them, because he's just been part of their lives for a decade or something.
It sets it up for future stories as well. This episode's one of the stepping stones towards the sort of future of the Rejects. Thank you, Carl, for appearing on this episode. We're going to hear now what actor Tom Weller thinks of this episode.
So that was, what was that, first series?
Yeah, episode 2.
Yeah, episode 2. Yeah, I mean, I remember it. I remember Alex Norton having his cheeks stuffed with tissue paper to make him look like Don Corleone from The Godfather. I remember James Corden very well. He was nice back then. And I mean, what I'm saying is, like, I haven't spoken to him in a long time, so I'm sure he's very nice now. But from what I hear, maybe he's not the same person as he was back then. But obviously he was an unknown back then, wasn't he? So, but a nice guy all the same.
The thing that I wanted to ask you about was, obviously, Paul Paris at that time had already done Grange Hill. Were any of you kind of starstruck by him?
No, I mean, my cousin was in Grange Hill with him. So I kind of knew of him. But I remember seeing him thinking, oh, look, that's Paul from Grange Hill. I remember that at the audition. But no, I don't think anyone was particularly starstruck. No, I think, we had some very famous people in Renford Rejects, footballers mainly. And I think there were some times when we would get a bit starstruck, like when Gianfranco Zola turned up, for example. That was just like, it was a big set. So there was probably 100 or so people sort of hanging around, and all of a sudden Gianfranco Zola turns up, and I just remember it going dead quiet and just looking over, and it was just like, wow, because he was one of the best players in the world at the time. And it was like, he's here right now. That was incredible. But no, as far as Paul Paris goes, no, I don't think anyone was particularly starstruck. We were just young actors doing a job, Yeah.
Was he one of those actors who kind of maintains character? Because Bruno must have been really hard to kind of keep up.
No, I don't think any of us were particularly doing method acting during those during that time. But he's Paul was. I mean, I have spoken to Paul a few years ago, but he was very. He knew his craft. Do you know what I mean? He was like. He was just, we were doing what we were doing, and then bam, he's in character, and he went for it. Let's say that he went for it, didn't he? He went all out, because obviously Paul Paris is very different from the character in Renford Rejects. But funny story, actually, talking about method acting. this was my first ever. I'd done a little bit of TV, but it was like real sort of basic stuff, like extra work and stuff like that. So this was like my first main thing. And when I'd come out of the Brit School, and so I was big on method acting. Like, it was something that I studied, Robert De Niro and Marlon Brando and stuff like that. So the director, Stephen Baywell, says to me, right, what I want you to do is I want you to look over there and then turn around. And I was like, yeah, Stephen, what am I looking at though? And his face it was a picture. He was like, don't worry about what you're looking at. Just do what I'm asking you to do. And then he went, who do you think you are, De Niro? And so that was the start and finish of my method acting career in regards to Renford Rejects. So, yeah.
Do you feel like you learned quite a lot during the run of the Rejects? Because at the beginning, you can tell that you're all very nervous about it.
Yeah, man, you couldn't be more right. I mean, I can't speak for anyone else, but I can speak for myself. And I said this before, that I was so nervous. I have a tick when I'm nervous and my mouth gets dry. And if you look carefully enough in some of the scenes, you'll see my tongue swilling around my mouth, and that's where my mouth is drying up. And my acting performance in the first series left a lot to be desired. I'm the first to admit that. But when we got to the second series, that's when things started to loosen up and I started to have a bit of fun with it. I wasn't playing it so straight. I just went more like cartoonish, you know. But I think for most of us, it was as a collective, it was our first sort of big TV thing that we'd done. So it takes a while to get into those characters. I mean, we didn't do a hell of a lot of sort of build up to it. We did a few read-throughs and, you know, a couple of exercises, but really it was just like, yeah, this is the first day of filming, get there and start filming. So there wasn't much time to sort of build up a character, but I think the more you play a character, the more you can start having fun with it and the more you loosen up. And I think that's, for me, it's like season 2, much looser, season 3, different level, and season 4, it was just a constant laugh with all of us. We knew our characters back to front. And so it was much easier to slip in and out of and have some fun with, you know. And I think if we're all honest, we stole lots of character ideas and mimicked other things we'd seen in films and things that we liked over the years, and we sort of threw them in. I think in my performance, you will see a lot of like Rick Mail and like Dumb and Dumber, that sort of stuff. And it's all stolen. So it's nothing, you know, it wasn't my own original stuff. Just giving the game away there, haven't I?
Can you think of any kind of particular examples of that?
Oh man, right. So it's like I say, if you look at sort of season 3 and season 4, if we were watching one together, I could point out loads. So there's little, it's like little, like the script is the script, so you sort of go along with the script and you do it in your character, but there's little sort of reactions and stuff like that are almost certainly stolen from like I say, like bits in Dumb and Dumber, because I loved that film at the time, and Rick Mail from a TV series called Bottom that I loved, and that was mine and Matt Leach's. That's how me and Matt Leach sort of bonded, was over that TV series. And so you'll see some of that in there. And there's a film, Happy Gilmore, and we used to all sit in the green room and watch this film over and over again. And so you'll see little bits of that in there. And I remember filming the golf episode, that's in season 4, with Matt Leach. And he went, you've got to, when you putt the ball, you've got to do a Shooter McGavin, which is a character from Happy Gilmore. And when he putts the ball, he sort of shoots the ball and then sort of blows his finger like he's just shot a gun. And I don't know if that made it in, but I certainly did it.
Talking of Matt Leach, very early on, myself and the person whom I went through this episode with noted that very early on he used quite a posh RP accent, which gets smoothed over later. Do you know whether that was that something he was doing, or was that something that the directors told him to do?
No, I think that's something he was doing, but he is quite posh anyway. So that's you heard it here first. Matt Leach is posh. Matt Leach is a good actor, and he speaks well. It really is as simple as that. And I think that was the whole idea. When I did that, I think it's called Best Laid Plans, which is the one where I dress up and sort of mimic all of the other rejects, I tried to do his accent. And me being a common Londoner, I found that very difficult. But I tried my best. But I think it's all his. It's not the characters were sort of set out for us, but we made up our characters ourselves. We developed them ourselves. There was no, I mean, the direction was there, obviously, but there was no one sort of saying, "Oh, can you play it like this or play it like that?" We just did it.
And it must have been quite difficult because the Rejects is kind of a unique thing where your scenes, there's no cuts or anything. It's just completely constant. I mean, how difficult was it to keep going with that?
That was the beautiful thing about it. I mean, obviously, when you were probably watching it when you were younger, you wouldn't have even noticed that. But it was really shot very, I mean, so differently from most of the stuff. Most of the stuff is just shot with, they'll do a wide, a close up, and then you're good to go. And then they'll edit it all together. But what we had to do is we had to rehearse each scene. And the reason we had to rehearse it because the camera moves around so much. So if you think about it, you've got all of the, you've got the lighting guys in the background. You've got, you might have the makeup people or whoever. So everyone is following this camera, like the back of the camera around. But also what we had to do was, there's little things like Paul Paris would sort of be on one side of the camera and then pop up on the next. So he would have to sort of run around the camera, navigate his way around, and then sort of pop up. And it was all very intricate, but I think what that did was it made for a much more beautiful sort of cinematography. Do you know what I mean? Like It wasn't just sort of thrown together. And I think I thought that was really well done by the producers there, because it would have been so much easier to do it another way. But our cameraman, Pierre Bofferty, who I think was nominated for an Oscar when he was younger, he really knew his stuff, and the director Stephen Baywell knew his stuff. And so we had to really rehearse because and as well, when we messed up, some of the scenes are like 5-6 minutes long. So if you messed up on like 5.5 minutes, you've got to go all the way back to the beginning and do it again. And believe me, we did mess up. So you really had to know your stuff. And I never used to learn my script. So I would learn it during rehearsals. I'm not someone who can sit down with a script and learn it. Roger Davis, who, I lived with while we were filming Renford, had so much dialogue. And I would sit there with him for hours of a night doing his dialogue with him. But me, I used to learn it on the day. And I remember doing a scene with Paul Paris, and I was eating burgers. I think it was like a burger eating contest. And one of our scenes was super long. And I remember getting there thinking, wow, I haven't learned any of this script. And we did 2 rehearsals and I'd learned the script straight. Like, it's just the only way I can do it. But sure, we messed up sometimes and sometimes. Let me tell you this quickly. So the biggest time I ever messed up was in, what's the one? Renford Rejects, I think it's called. And I could not, it was all written in sort of oldish English, and I could not say this little speech that I had. I just couldn't do it. And the more and more frustrated I get, and the more and more everyone was getting frustrated with me, the less I could do it. And in the end, I think they just went, look, do it off camera and we'll just cut it together. And I think that's what they did. It was a horrible, horrible day.
I mean, it doesn't show in the episode anyway.
It doesn't, but let me tell you, everyone was getting the right hump with me because I just could not get this thing, man. It was terrible.
I think one of the things about Terry's character is that you did a lot of scenes with Bill, obviously, who played Basil Stoker, and the episode in which we're talking about, he doesn't appear, which tells me that early on they're trying to kind of establish you as a separate entity before finding out, well, actually, father and son work perfectly. Do you feel like maybe the stronger episodes were when you were working with Bill?
Yeah, I think so, because it's like a double act, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think what they did, I think they realised that. So from season 1, I don't know how many episodes I was in on season 1, but it wasn't a lot. And I think that they realised that the Bill, Bill and my character, so Terry and adult Stoker, worked well as a double act, and they could play off the rejects against them. So I think what happened in season 2, and especially season 3 and 4, is it was basically all about the Stokers versus the Rejects. And that just got more and more. So I think in the last series, I was in pretty much all the episodes in some kind of capacity. And it just got more and more and more. And what they did, I remember in season 2 when the executive producer called me into the office and said, and I thought I was in trouble. I didn't know what I'd done. And he was like, look, whatever you're doing, do more of it, because this is good stuff. I love what you've done with the character, because like I say, I'd kind of completely changed it. I wasn't playing it straight anymore. And I think that Bill did the same. I think, well, no, actually, Bill was sort of like that from the get-go. But I think we started working much better together. And it was funnier and it worked better, And so, I think they just realised from quite early on that it was better that Bill and I did our scenes together, or there was more dialogue together. We were a more ferocious team, as it were.
That's me, Jamie Dyer, talking to actor Tom Weller about his role in the Renford Rejects episode Don Bruno. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you to both of my guests, including the aforementioned Tom Weller and Carl as well. If you'd like to be a guest on a future edition of the podcast, I would love to talk to you about your interest in the Renford Rejects. Tweet at @ReRenford. You can also message us on that as well. Please do get in touch and let's celebrate once again down at Gracelands the Renford Rejects. Razors included. Thanks very much for listening, and bye-bye for now.